Welcome back to part 2 of this special masterclass on Board of Directors. Last week, we released part 1, where we covered how to land your first board position, the difference between advisory and director roles, and more. This week, we go into how to be a productive board member yourself, how to run productive board meetings, and how to make sure you don't get stuck on a toxic board. Stay tuned, we got a lot for you.
Welcome to Leadership Mindset 2.0. Practical neuroscience and psychology to transform you from a tactical doer into a strategic leader. Here is your host, former social entrepreneur of the year and coach to some of the world's top executives, R. Michael Anderson.
That leads us to our next question, which we alluded to. If I'm asked to be on a board, how do I know it's a healthy board? How do I know it's a healthy environment?
It's a brilliant question. And let's face it, it's all like dating. As in dating, you just have to give yourself time. And through my approach, it gives me the chance to sort of understand the feel of what's happening. So, for example, if someone wanted me to join a board, I would probably ask to do at least one session where I attended the board meeting as an observer. So I would attend the board meeting, I would sign the confidentiality paperwork, but I would simply sit there and watch how their board meeting run and not say anything.
What would you look for in the board meeting?
I would look for the behaviours. I couldn't really at that stage understand enough about the data, but I would look for the behaviours. So, for example, if people turned up 10 minutes late for the board meeting, if people were unprepared, particularly if the chief exec was not really engaging, these would all be warning signs for me. Now, of course, they may be wanting me to come in to professionalise that, so that's great. There's also the other side of this. So if I go in and someone's talking to me about helping them get better board meetings, and I go in and they're perfect, I'm probably going to decline it because there's not a bigger vector for me to make a difference. So what we do in our world today is we try to understand people. So one thing about Michael is Michael has been consistent in his relationship with me for probably 20 years. And that consistency is hugely valuable because it's indicative of his behavior will be consistent going forward. People, even just over a couple of months, if someone, they take 3 weeks to respond to my email, or I give them advice and then they phone me up and say, that was good advice, Russell, but I've met someone else who's given me better advice. And there's a contradiction there. These are all warning signs for me.
Yeah, exactly. There should be a healthy amount of discussion about things, I think, in a board meeting. And if somebody's if they just go through point by point by point, but nobody asks questions, nobody digs into things in a healthy way, if there's no diversity of like thought or people in there, those are potential, because some boards are created with a bunch of yes people, and there potentially is a lot of politics under that.
There's a piece there as well about if you're looking for a board, but if you're looking for a board or an advisory position with a company, if you have some form of public presence built around yourself, for example, on LinkedIn, that gives them an opportunity to assess you because they can use a product like LinkedIn to perhaps read some of your posts, see what you like. They will see if we both know the same people. So all of those things help. And I think, I don't believe anyone goes into a meeting in the West now without checking out someone's LinkedIn profile. And I had a really unusual situation with a civil servant in London, and I was asked to meet this person, and they didn't use LinkedIn. And my immediate assumption was, oh, that's strange. And it's interesting how these have become the norms in the way that we assess situations.
Yeah, and you also, I believe, want to make sure their values and personality matches yours. I'm very entrepreneurial. That's why I didn't fit in with that other nonprofit board. They were a great organization, but that wasn't. And sometimes when there's a difference, you add that to the board, which they need, and sometimes that can work against you in the case of me.
I think as well, there's an importance that we're true to ourselves. So when I look at a board meeting or a board gathering, I'm looking for rigorous honesty. So I'm looking for people to leave their egos at the door and to come into and to assess what is actually happening. If I'm head of product, the fact the product keeps on failing, my job's not to be at the board and protect my team. My job is to be there and honestly report why we're seeing this failure rate and what we're going to do about it. And I think what someone once said that to me, that when they introduced me to someone, they said, Russell will be able to help you in your business, but be careful, he'll tell you the truth. And I found that a great endorsement.
This is something that I wanted to cover earlier, but I forgot. In the UK, and I think it can be like this in the US, but I think it happens more in the UK, non-exec directors, so these are directors that aren't like a member of your regular team, they can also do special projects for the organization. So, maybe Russell is on a board as non-exec director, but maybe he comes in 2 extra days a month for a couple months to help with, help get a sales strategy in or something.
Possibly. I'd be very careful about doing that though, because that can cross over from, the risk of being a shadow director, for example. So I would have to seriously consider whether, so if I was on the board and we identified that we needed to bring in a sales expert, I would probably identify someone to bring in rather than doing it myself.
Okay, interesting, because I've heard that a couple times that the non-exec director that I've talked to, they're like, yeah, I also come in an extra day to work with, the product
I'm not sure I would do that. It's just that for me personally, it's going to cloud my decision making because I'm going to know one particular vertical within the organization.
Yeah, because I haven't heard that much in the States. So
I'll tell you, one thing I have done is projects external to the company. So, for example, I recently started working with a startup and they've got about 10 clients. So I said that I wanted to go and talk to the 10 clients. And I spoke to those 10 clients and it gave me unique insight into how the company was being perceived, where the opportunities are, where they were dropping the ball. But it was external to the company rather than internal.
That makes a lot of sense. Do board members get compensated? If so, how much?
The answer's yes, sometimes. I would typically see that figure is dependent on the company, the stage, the sector, and the geographical location. So I live in Scotland in the UK. So if I was giving advice to a small family business on a farm in the countryside, I would probably assume that they're going to pay me less than a fintech in the city of London. So there's a difference there. There's also how you're compensated. So the most normal aspect would be an invoiced for cash sum each month. But it may be a sweat equity stake where you're getting a percentage of the company. Or it may be that you're awarded via product, for example. So I've got a friend who advises a Scottish distillery and they pay him in whisky. So be open to understanding what's the most appropriate for yourself.
Russell's always got cool stories, that's for sure. Here's a specific question somebody sent in, and they're on the call. So if you want to jump in, whoever's on the call, when I ask it, that's great. And if not, that's okay too. I'd like to know the function of the board of directors and whether they have executive power in the company and giving instructions for the company's operation. For example, appointment of contractors or in the company, recruitment of employees in the company, etc.
So that'll depend on the articles of association and the rules of the the rules of individual company as to what the responsibilities are. I think you raise a good point though. So if I was appointing people to a board, I would have a job description for them and I would have an expectation as to what they're going to deliver. So if someone comes in and says, I'm going to open up new funding streams for you from investment syndicates, I would want that laid out that that's what they're doing. They're there as an advisor on the board, but they have this external role as well. And I would measure that. We have to be very careful over a board member influencing the executive team's decision-making, for example, in the appointment of suppliers or hires. So there may be a senior hire going on and someone says, Russell, would you sit in the interview or would you have a chat with this person? And I would do that, but that would be I wouldn't be the final word on whether or not to hire someone. I would be merely handing my insight over.
Great. What mistakes do boards make?
Just about anything you can imagine. These are people, and as people, we are the most inconsistent thing you can imagine, because we change in situations, we change by mood, we change by where we are in our life, etc. I think the most dangerous thing is not to have the board meeting. I think it's about consistency. So if you have a quarterly board meeting, you have a quarterly board meeting. You don't have, oh, we're not going to bother this month, because that indicates it's not a board meeting, it's actually a management meeting. So I think there's a consistency there. I think following up on the actions and making sure those are completed is essential. I think publishing the actions from the previous board meeting the week before the next board meeting is indicative of a problem. So it's fixing all of these things to make it work as best as possible. A board can be the greatest value creator in your business. If you get a board right, you'll have people round about that board who, for a fraction of what you would pay them as an executive, will make you serious money. They may identify an acquisition. They may identify a top talent that's available. They may identify a grant that's available. That's where they add so much value. But it's up to you to work them, to help them to do that. I spoke to someone recently who said that they had a non-executive board member who'd refused to name the company on his LinkedIn because he was worried it would have a negative effect on his brand. And I said, well, how does that make you feel? And he said, well, it makes me feel terrible, Russell. I said, yes. So why is he on your board?
That leads to another question. What if a board member is not the right fit?
Remove them. Board members are not puppies. You don't get them for forever. I would suggest that companies should be regularly changing, particularly their advisory board members, because their skills will be appropriate at different stages of the company's growth.
Okay, only one or two more. Get named to a board that's not my board. What can I do to make sure that I'm successful? Like what's some good advice to be successful as a board member?
So I sit down with the chief exec. So typically I'm a chairman. So I sit down with the chief exec and we work out what the goal is. So if Michael joins our board, we say, right, this is why we're bringing on Michael. This is what we want him to achieve, and this is how we're going to support him, and this is how we're going to measure him. And that's what we do. Now, as the chairman, as opposed to the chief exec, I will have conversations with Michael outside boardroom, say, how are you getting on with this? How's that progressing? Here's some challenges we're facing. So a lot of the work takes place outside the boardroom. Like the most interesting directorship questions I've had usually happen at 11 o'clock at night on the telephone. Because I'm not an employee, right? I can accept the call at 11 o'clock at night on the telephone because I've made myself available, and it's those decisions. And I had one with a chap who his business was in a terrible state, but we managed to get him a sizable exit. And he suddenly decided the night before that he wasn't sure whether or not to accept the offer. I said, but we've done it all. He said, no, Russell, but I've got this, so maybe I could get a lot more. So as a director of the company, I said to him, why don't you sleep on it? Or even better, why don't you ask your wife what you should do? So the next morning he phoned up and said, we're selling. Because it's that understanding about how to influence people is something we all do, and it's so important in that boardroom situation. And it means a lot having the gravitas to be able to have those conversations with people. And by seeing you sweating on the board alongside the other board members, that's how you get the confidence. There was something else we were talking about, financial reward. The financial reward might be the fact that I've decided to invest capital into the company, and then I'm getting an annual dividend or something. So there's so many different ways to work this. But the only thing that really matters is that you are providing value. And everyone knows what the value is. And that family situation of husband and wife talking, the person who owns the company and their spouse, you want to make sure that the conversation around their kitchen table is, I'm so glad I hired Michael. He's been a superstar, and not, how much are we paying Russell? That's where so you have to be clear that all the time you're adding value.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And for people just joining a board, first thing is, like Russell said, a lot of it happens outside. I'd potentially set up a lunch or a coffee with each, depends on how big the board is, but especially the CEO and the chair, to get really clear about what they perceive your value is, what they need you for. And once you get to the board meeting, assert yourself. You're there for a reason. Don't take 4 meetings to fit in. If you don't understand something, say something. If you're saying stuff too much, they'll tell you, but you're there for a reason. So step out of your comfort zone. I know it's all your first board meeting. There's all these people, senior people that you don't know, but realize you're there for a reason, and make sure you're providing the value. That's really what you need to do on your own.
I'll give you a great example there. So I was approached by a young director, and she'd taken her first non-exec directorship position. And she said, Russell, I don't know how you can sit on multiple boards, because the organization I'm with, which was a not-profit, has a board meeting every month, and the board pack they circulate is 100 pages. And I'm really struggling to find the time to read it all before the board meeting. And my advice to her, she said, how do you do it? I said, well, you go to the chair and you say, this is unacceptable, this 100 pages. I want a board pack that's no more than 2 pages, because I'm a human being and I don't have time to read all this. And she said that when she came back to me, she said, I did that. And I'm going, what happened? And she said, the chair said, I completely agreed, but no one's ever thought of doing that before. And that's what they did. So you can have a huge value just with a touch of common sense. Imagine not only the 100-page board pack, imagine the executive effort that had to go in to produce that.
Russell, I sometimes think people pay you for your common sense.
Excellent. More.
All right, Russell, anything, we covered a lot here. You're amazing as always. Anything else comes to your mind that you would want to tell people that are small business owners going to be on a board that we maybe haven't touched on?
I would urge anyone with an organization to think about who could be helping them. So I can think of no company I know that would not be better for having Michael involved. But they're probably too shy to phone Michael up and say, hey, would you come and help us? Now, I know companies that would benefit hugely from Michael's skills, but not as an author and not as a public speaker or educator, but because you've built tech businesses in America. So if I'm a UK company trying to get my tech into America, your words of insight are incredibly valuable. When I say, oh, we were going to cold call people, and you say, don't do that, do this. That's the value, incredible value. And also the fact that if my company was to appoint our Michael Anderson as a director or as an advisor and put that on my website, my clients are going to go, wow, he looks amazing. How did you persuade him to come and help you? And that's what we are. That's our world.
So handsome and everything. I know. But
at that age, yeah.
Russell, thank you so much for this. Tell us, you are on boards, but you also do things like board audits, correct? Can you just talk a little bit about what companies bring you in, for example, to do so if somebody's, and we're going to put Russell's info in the show notes. So if you're interested, you can contact him through there.
So what will happen is you meet the chief exec, and the chief exec says, we have board meetings, Russell, but I'm not sure they're delivering as much value as they could be. So they've put up the flag to wave it to say something's wrong. So what I would do is I would read the previous, say, 3 months worth of board papers, and I would ask to sit in as an observer. And really, I'm just sitting there watching what's happening. At the end of the board meeting, myself and the chief exec would go off for a coffee, and he would say, what do you think, Russell? And I'd say, well, can I ask you, what do you think? And at that point, the chief exec would say, that one's not delivering. Don't know what he does. He's always wrong. He never shows up. And I'd say, that's really interesting. You've got concerns about some of the people around the table. How will we correct that? So I'm providing a pure advisory role or coaching role, whereby the CEO knows what's wrong. None of us are daft. So he knows what's wrong, but he's looking for me to help him. And then I help most with the implementation. Because asking someone to step down from your board requires, can sometimes require an external party to do that. And in London in particular, the 6'5" guy with the Scottish accent, that's what you want. Just to explain quite clearly that this is the time to step down. But it's more than that. It's making sure that we go through the correct process, etc. And usually when you start these conversations, the board member knows they're not delivering. I hadn't really thought about stepping down, and we do that. So it's all about advising the business, not the people, and that's that role of the board.
Thank you so much, Russell. I just always have so much fun doing stuff with you, and I you bring you just get to the point with the common sense. I love it every time. So if you're out there listening and you're like, hey, we have a board that's not performing what it should be, contact Russell. He's the most generous guy with his time. He'll always have a conversation with everybody. So reach out to him. If you're a Leadership Mindset 2.0 fan, I also have a 2-hour board connector program. So I come in and I work with your board for 2 hours. It gets people communicating better, more trust, etc. You can contact me if you have an interest in potentially having Russell or I on your board. Drop us a note. Absolutely, we'll talk to you. And in the meantime, one thing that Russell said that really, really made me stop and think that your board could be the biggest competitive advantage you have. It could be the thing that moves your company ahead more than anything else. And part of me knew that, but part of me needed to hear that too. So thank you for that, Russell. That really landed with me. And thanks everybody for listening. We will see you next time. There you go. A whole massive download on Board of Directors. Just remember, if you want to get in touch with Russell, his contact information is in the show notes. And if you have any questions about Board of Directors or this podcast episode, you can contact me directly. You can go to one of the Leadership Mindset 2.0 Facebook or LinkedIn groups. There's a whole bunch of ways. Just reach out and ask your questions. I answer every single thing that comes in. And that's it. Now you have what you need to be a massively effective leader on a board of directors. And stay tuned for later this month. We got some good stuff cooking for you. See you soon.